The champagne glass hit the floor before the man did. 1 second, retired Navy SEAL Commander Daniel Cross was laughing across the dinner table. The next, his chair scraped backward, his hand locked around his throat, and no air came out. People shouted for someone to call 911. I was already moving. "Claire, don't," my fiancé snapped. "You're not a real doctor." I ignored him, lowered Cross to the carpet, and gave 3 calm instructions. The restaurant manager froze. 2 guests started crying. My fiancé kept telling everyone I was only a glorified medic. Then Cross stopped breathing. I opened his airway, found what was blocking it, and worked until his chest finally rose. When his eyes opened, they fixed on the faded mark beneath my wristwatch. His expression changed. "Nightingale?" he whispered. At the far end of the room, a Navy admiral stood so quickly his chair overturned. My fiancé looked from him to me, and for the first time that evening, he stopped smiling. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in the upstairs bedroom of a waterfront house outside Annapolis, fastening a small silver clasp at the back of my dress. The windows were cracked open to the Chesapeake air. Somewhere below, someone had lifted the lid on a smoker, and the smell of hickory, pepper, and glazed ribs drifted through the curtains. My fiancé, Grant Mercer, appeared in the doorway holding 2 champagne flutes. He wore a Navy dinner jacket and the expression he used when he wanted the world to know the room belonged to him. "You're wearing that watch?" I looked down at the old black field watch on my left wrist. "Yes. It looks military." "It is." Grant handed me a glass. "Tonight isn't about work, Claire." I took the champagne but did not drink it. Tonight was our engagement dinner. Grant had invited his parents, 2 business partners, several retired officers his father knew from the Naval Academy, and enough people from Annapolis society to make the evening feel less like a celebration and more like an audition. His mother had chosen the flowers. His father had chosen the guest list. Grant had chosen which parts of my life were acceptable to mention. He liked telling people I worked in emergency medicine. He did not like the questions that followed when they learned I had spent 12 years in uniform. "You know how my father is," he said. "He respects real command experience." I adjusted the cuff of my dress over the thin scar beneath my watch. "I know." Grant smiled as though I had agreed with him. Downstairs, laughter rose from the dining room. On the dresser beside me sat a cream-colored envelope with my name written in block letters. It had arrived that morning without a return address. Inside was a single card. "Commander Daniel Cross will be attending tonight." Nothing else. I had read it 3 times, then placed it back in the envelope. I had not seen Daniel Cross in almost 9 years. The last time I saw him, rain had been hammering the roof of a transport aircraft, while 2 corpsmen held pressure against his chest. He had been unconscious. I had been covered in dust, fuel, and someone else's blood, repeating the same sentence until the pilot finally heard me. "Keep the aircraft level." Grant glanced at the envelope. "What's that?" "Nothing important." He accepted the answer because he had already turned toward the mirror. At dinner, I was seated between Grant and his mother, Lorraine. Across from us sat retired Commander Cross, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and quieter than the rest of the table. He did not recognize me. Not at first. Grant raised his glass. "To family, partnership, and knowing exactly where you belong." Everyone drank. Then Lorraine asked what kind of medicine I practiced. Before I could answer, Grant laughed. "Claire patches people up in emergency rooms. Very dramatic. She used to do something similar in the military." "Something similar?" Cross asked. Grant leaned back. "Glorified medic work." A few people smiled politely. I noticed Cross stop cutting his steak. Then his eyes dropped to the watch on my wrist. Cross looked at my watch for only a second. Then he lowered his eyes to his plate. If anyone else noticed, they gave no sign. Grant's father, Richard Mercer, lifted his wineglass and smiled across the table. "Military medicine has its place," he said, "but command is a different kind of responsibility." Richard had spent 6 years in the Navy before leaving for law school. He spoke about those years as if he had personally directed every fleet movement in the Atlantic. Grant inherited that habit. Neither man had ever asked what I had done in uniform. They preferred the version that made the hierarchy comfortable. Richard had been an officer. Grant had built a successful defense consulting firm. I had carried bandages. "Claire understands that," Grant said. "She's never claimed to be a strategist." I set my fork beside my plate. "No," I said, "I haven't." The answer pleased him. It usually did. Grant had mistaken my unwillingness to compete with him for agreement. At first, I thought that misunderstanding was harmless. Later, I began helping him maintain it. When we met 2 years earlier, I had already learned how to make my past small enough to fit inside polite conversation. I told people I had served as a physician. I said I had worked overseas. If they asked whether I had seen combat, I told them my assignments had been complicated. Most people understood the boundary. Grant treated it like an unfinished puzzle. He asked about medals, units, missions, and famous names, not because he wanted to understand what I had lived through, but because he wanted to know whether any of it would impress the people who mattered to him. When I refused to give details, he decided there were none. The truth was that I had spent 12 years as a Navy physician, including multiple assignments supporting joint special operations teams. I was not a SEAL. I never claimed to be one. I did not kick down doors or lead raids. My job began when plans failed. Sometimes I worked inside secure field hospitals, sometimes aboard aircraft, sometimes in places where the maps were deliberately vague and everyone used names that were not their own. I learned to hear changes in breathing beneath engine noise. I learned how fear moved through a team before anyone admitted it was there. And I learned that saving 4 people did not make the 5th absence weigh any less. 9 years earlier, Daniel Cross had been brought to me during an extraction that was already collapsing. His team had been separated after an intelligence failure. The weather closed in, communications became unreliable. By the time they reached the pickup point, Cross was barely conscious, and Chief Petty Officer Jonah Hale was still outside the perimeter. I stabilized Cross inside the aircraft. Then I ordered the pilot to hold position. We waited beyond the safe window. 30 seconds became a minute. 1 minute became 3. Someone shouted that we had to leave. I kept looking through the open door, expecting Jonah to appear through the rain. He never did. The official report said staying longer would have risked the aircraft, the crew, and every injured man aboard. The review board found that my decisions had preserved multiple lives. None of that changed the empty seat across from me. Afterward, I became Nightingale to the men who survived. The name was not a compliment in the beginning. It came from a damaged radio transmission. Someone had tried to call for the night medical team, and the words blurred together through static. Later, they kept using it. I did not. I left active duty 3 years after that mission. I completed additional emergency medicine training and returned to civilian work, where no one knew the nickname and no one looked at me as if I carried the last minutes of their lives in my hands. I thought anonymity would feel like peace. For a while, it did. Then I met Grant. He was charming when we were alone. He remembered how I took my coffee. He brought dinner to the hospital during overnight shifts. When fireworks went off unexpectedly at a summer festival and I had to step away from the crowd, he followed without asking questions. That was the man I agreed to marry. The other version emerged slowly. He corrected my stories in front of friends. He introduced me as Claire, the former medic, even after I reminded him that I was a physician. When someone asked about my service, he answered for me. She mostly worked in clinics. She doesn't like to exaggerate. It sounds more exciting than it was. Always with a smile, always followed by the same excuse. I'm only joking. I told myself his insecurity was not cruelty. I told myself love sometimes meant allowing another person to feel larger. That was the mistake. Across the dinner table, Lorraine Mercer turned toward me. Grant tells us you may reduce your hours after the wedding. I looked at him. He was buttering a piece of bread. We haven't decided that, I said. Grant did not look up. We discussed it. You discussed it. A brief pause passed around the table. Richard cleared his throat. Well, emergency departments are hardly family-friendly. Lorraine smiled gently, the way people do when they want control to look like concern. A marriage needs one person willing to protect the home. I protect my home, I said. Grant finally looked at me. No one said you didn't. His tone carried a warning that only I was meant to hear. Commander Cross had stopped eating. He sat with one hand near his water glass, watching us without appearing to. At the far end of the table sat retired Vice Admiral Evelyn Shaw, one of Richard's most important guests. She had commanded medical and logistics operations before retiring and now served on the board of a naval foundation Grant hoped to work with. Grant had spent most of the evening trying to impress her. She had spent most of the evening asking the servers whether they needed help carrying anything. When Lorraine mentioned my hospital schedule, Admiral Shaw turned slightly. Which emergency department? Anne Arundel Medical Center, I said. She's excellent with stitches, Grant added. Admiral Shaw looked at him. I imagine the department requires more than stitches. Grant laughed. Of course. Claire is very capable when things are controlled. My hand became still beside my plate. He knew that phrase. Things are controlled. I had used it once in a private conversation after waking from a nightmare. I had told him I could handle blood, noise, and pressure, but sometimes struggled when I could not identify where a sound was coming from. Grant had held me that night. Now he smiled at his guests. She gets a little overwhelmed when things become unpredictable. No one laughed. Grant noticed, so he tried again. You should have seen her during a car backfire last spring. Nearly took cover behind a flower stand. Lorraine touched his arm. Grant. What? Claire knows I'm teasing. He turned to me. Tell them. I looked at his hand resting on the tablecloth. A month earlier, I would have rescued him. I would have smiled and said it was nothing. That night, I said, it wasn't a car. His smile tightened. What? It was a ceremonial cannon at the harbor. I stepped away for less than a minute. Richard shifted in his chair. Admiral Shaw's attention sharpened. Grant leaned closer. You're proving my point. No, I said. I'm correcting the story. The words were quiet, but something changed in his expression. Grant could tolerate silence because he believed it belonged to him. Correction felt like rebellion. He lifted his champagne and addressed the table. This is what living with a medical professional is like. Every detail must be clinically accurate. A few guests lowered their eyes. Cross spoke for the first time since the conversation began. Accuracy tends to matter in her line of work. Grant glanced at him. Of course, Commander. I didn't mean any disrespect. You weren't speaking to me. Cross's voice remained even. Grant's jaw moved once. Then he smiled again. That was how he recovered control. He made the next insult sound friendlier than the last. I admire what Claire did, he said. Truly, but she has a habit of carrying the military with her. The watch, the old files, the mysterious phone calls. My eyes moved to him. What files? He reached beneath his chair and lifted a narrow wooden box. I recognized it immediately. It had been stored on the top shelf of my office closet. Locked. Grant placed it beside his plate. I thought tonight might be the right time to help you let some things go. My body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the open windows. Where did you get that? Our house, he said. Our closet. My office. We're getting married, Claire. There shouldn't be locked rooms between us. The box contained 3 objects. My field watch's original case, a folded flag patch darkened by years of use, and a letter I had written to Jonah Hale's mother, but never sent. I had carried that letter through 2 moves and 1 deployment. I had never shown it to anyone. Grant opened the box. Close it. He pretended not to hear me. Grant. Lorraine's hand rose to her throat. Richard stared at the table. Admiral Shaw placed her glass down with careful precision. Cross's face had changed, though I could not yet name why. Grant unfolded the letter. I found something that explains why Claire has trouble moving forward. I stood. Do not read that. His eyes flicked toward the guests. He knew he had gone too far. But he also knew that stopping now would mean admitting it. So he continued. Claire wrote this to the family of a man she couldn't save. The waterfront sounds seemed to recede. The clink of silverware from the kitchen, the wind against the glass, the low music playing from the next room. Grant read one line. I should have brought him home. He lowered the page and looked at me with manufactured sympathy. This is what I've been trying to help her understand. She was a medic in a terrible situation. She did what she could, but she wasn't in charge of the mission. Across the table, Cross's fingers tightened around his knife. I did not answer Grant. I was looking at the letter in his hand. For years, I had believed strength meant containing pain, so it did not inconvenience anyone else. At that moment, I understood what my silence had taught him. It had taught him that every boundary could be moved. It had taught him that my private grief was available for his performance. Grant reached for my wrist. And this watch has become part of the problem. I pulled my hand back. He caught the strap anyway. The old leather gave with a dry snap. Grant stared at it, surprised. The watch fell onto the table between us. Cross rose halfway from his chair. His eyes were fixed on the faded patch inside the open box. It was a simple black square, marked with a silver bird and 4 narrow lines beneath it. What unit gave you that? He asked. Grant answered before I could. Probably some medical support group. Cross did not look at him. He looked at me. Before either of us could speak, a server entered carrying the main course. Plates moved around the table. Chairs shifted. Grant folded my letter and pushed it back into the box as if the interruption had erased what he had done. I picked up my broken watch. The second hand was still moving. Grant leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Sit down. We'll discuss your behavior later." That sentence ended our engagement. He did not know it yet. I sat only because walking out would have meant leaving my letter in his possession. Cross settled back into his chair, but his attention remained on the watch in my palm. The server placed a plate in front of him. Glazed beef, roasted vegetables, a small garnish of crushed nuts. Cross frowned. I requested no nuts. The server stopped. Grant waved one hand. "It's only a garnish. They can remove it." Cross's breathing changed. I heard it before anyone saw it. A shallow pull of air, then another. His fork slipped from his fingers. I was already standing when his champagne glass struck the floor. Cross's champagne glass shattered against the hardwood. His chair tipped sideways as he grabbed at his throat. For half a second, no one moved. Then everyone moved at once. Lorraine screamed. Richard shouted for someone to call an ambulance. A server ran toward the kitchen. Grant stood so quickly that his knee struck the table, sending silverware and wine across the white cloth. I reached Cross before he hit the floor. "Give us space." My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. Admiral Shaw moved first. She pushed 2 chairs away and ordered the guests back. The manager appeared in the doorway holding a red emergency case. Cross was conscious, but barely. His breathing had narrowed to a strained sound. Redness spread above his collar. "Severe allergy?" I asked. He managed one small nod. "Epinephrine?" His hand moved weakly toward the inside pocket of his jacket. Grant stepped closer. "Claire, the ambulance is coming." I held out my hand without looking at him. "Move back. I'm trying to help." "You're blocking the light." Something in my tone made him obey. I found Cross's injector, administered it, and checked his pulse. It was fast and weakening. The manager opened the emergency case. I gave him instructions. Admiral Shaw repeated them when his hands began to shake. The room became smaller, not quiet, focused. There was the distant voice of the 911 operator on speakerphone, the wind pushing against the windows, Lorraine crying into both hands, and Cross trying to pull air through a closing airway. For 9 years, I had avoided rooms that felt like that. A body on the floor. People waiting for me to decide. The knowledge that calm could not guarantee a good ending. My hands remembered before fear could stop them. I positioned him, monitored his breathing, and prepared for the next step if the medication failed. Grant crouched a few feet away. "Are you sure you know what you're doing?" Admiral Shaw turned toward him. "Mr. Mercer." He stopped speaking. Cross's breathing ceased. The room reacted with one collective inhale. I did not. I began working. The old rhythm returned. Assessment, action, reassessment. No wasted movement. No promises I could not keep. The manager followed my instructions. Admiral Shaw kept the emergency dispatcher updated. One of the guests opened the front doors for the paramedics. Grant remained frozen beside the overturned chair. Seconds passed. Then Cross's chest rose. A rough breath entered him. Another followed. The sound was weak, but it was air. Lorraine sobbed with relief. I kept one hand near Cross's shoulder and told him not to move. His eyes opened slowly. For a moment, they wandered past the ceiling lights and the faces above him. Then they found me. My sleeve had pulled back while I worked. The broken field watch lay on the floor nearby, exposing the faded 4-line mark beneath my wrist. Cross stared at it. His face changed, not because he recognized the scar, because he recognized where it came from. "Nightingale?" he whispered. The name passed through the room like a current. Admiral Shaw went still. At the far end of the dining table, Richard Mercer lowered himself into his chair. Grant looked at Cross, then at me. "What did he call you?" Cross tried to sit up. I pressed a hand lightly against his shoulder. "Stay down, Commander." His eyes did not leave my face. "It is you." The first paramedics entered through the open doors carrying equipment. I gave them a concise report and stepped aside as they took over. One of them glanced at me. "You medical?" "She is," Cross said through the oxygen mask. His voice was stronger now. The paramedic continued working. Cross lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward the black patch still visible inside the wooden box. "Where did you get that?" Grant answered. "It belongs to Claire. Some field medical unit, apparently." Cross removed the mask long enough to speak. "That is not a field medical unit." The senior paramedic tried to replace it, but Cross raised one finger. "One sentence." He looked directly at Grant. That patch was issued to 6 people attached to Joint Task Group Meridian, 4 operators, 1 intelligence officer, and the physician who kept us alive. Grant's face tightened. Claire said she worked medical support. She did. Cross's gaze hardened. Support does not mean safe. The paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher. As they secured the straps, Admiral Shaw walked around the table and stopped in front of me. She looked at the insignia, then at my face. Captain Bennett? I had not heard that title spoken aloud in years. Grant gave a short, nervous laugh. Captain? Admiral Shaw did not acknowledge him. I reviewed the Meridian casualty file, she said. Your name was sealed in the public record. It should have remained that way. Her expression softened, but only slightly. Perhaps. But your fiancé opened a box that was not his. Grant's eyes moved around the room. He was searching for the version of events in which he still had authority. Everyone needs to calm down, he said. Claire never told me any of this. Cross turned his head on the stretcher. Did you ever ask without trying to measure whether it impressed you? Grant's mouth opened. No answer came. Cross continued. She held our aircraft on the ground during an active extraction while I was bleeding out. Richard stared at me. Grant shook his head. That doesn't make sense. She just said she was the doctor. She was the senior medical officer aboard, Admiral Shaw said. In a casualty evacuation, her authority over patient survival was not ceremonial. Cross's voice grew rough. The pilot wanted to leave. She refused until every recoverable man was aboard. My eyes dropped to the broken watch in my hand. Every recoverable man. The phrase had lived inside the report. It had never felt true. Grant picked up the letter from the box. But this says she failed someone. Cross saw Jonah's name at the top of the page. His entire expression shifted. Put that down. Grant held it tighter. I'm only trying to understand. No, I said. You were trying to expose me. Grant looked at the faces around him and understood that none of them would rescue him from the distinction. Cross's eyes closed briefly. Jonah Hale went back for our interpreter, he said. I looked at him. That detail had never appeared in the version I was given. Cross opened his eyes again. He found the man alive. They were less than 200 yards from us when the second blast cut off the route. My throat tightened. The report said Jonah had broken from the team before extraction. The report protected the intelligence source, Admiral Shaw said quietly. The complete file was compartmentalized. I had spent 9 years believing Jonah had been disoriented, that I had waited for a man who had become lost in chaos. Cross shook his head. He heard the aircraft. He knew you were holding it. The dining room blurred at the edges. Then why didn't he come? Cross looked at me with the grief of someone who had carried the answer too long. Because the interpreter could not walk. No one spoke. He sent us a final transmission, Cross continued. It never reached your channel. He told us to leave before you lost the entire aircraft trying to bring him home. The broken watch pressed into my palm. Grant's expression changed again. Not into compassion. Into opportunity. So none of this was Claire's fault, he said, as though he had solved the evening. That's what I've been trying to tell her. Cross stared at him. You read her private letter to a room full of strangers. I was helping her move forward. You called the woman who saved my life a glorified medic. Grant straightened. I didn't know who she was. That sentence ended, what little remained. I looked at him. You knew who I was to you. He stopped. You just thought that was not enough. The paramedics began moving Cross toward the doors. Before they carried him out, he raised his hand. Every retired service member at the table stood. Admiral Shaw stood first. Richard followed more slowly. Cross held my gaze. Captain Bennett, he said, Jonah knew you waited. My eyes burned, but I did not look away. And he did not blame you. The stretcher disappeared through the doorway. Behind me, Grant said my name. I removed the engagement ring from my finger. Then I placed it beside the letter he had stolen. The sound it made against the table was almost nothing. But this time, everyone heard it. Grant did not touch the ring. For several seconds, he only stared at it. The doors closed behind the paramedics. Their siren faded down the waterfront road, leaving the house full of people who no longer knew where to look. Lorraine was the first to move. She came around the table and reached for my arm. Claire, everyone is upset. This is not the moment to make permanent decisions. I stepped back before she could touch me. It became permanent when he opened the box. Grant finally found his voice. You are seriously ending our engagement over one mistake? I looked at the broken watch in my hand. One mistake is forgetting an anniversary. His face hardened. I was worried about you. You wanted an audience. That is not fair. No, I said. It isn't. The answer unsettled him more than anger would have. Richard rose slowly from his chair. Grant, he said, stop talking. Grant turned toward his father. You're taking her side? Richard looked older than he had an hour earlier. I watched you read a dead man's name from a private letter after she told you to stop. He was not just a dead man, I said. The room shifted toward me. Jonah Hale was a teammate. He was a son. He went back for someone who could not walk. I looked at Grant. And you reduced him to evidence in an argument you wanted to win. Admiral Shaw closed the wooden box and placed both hands over the lid. I will see that this is returned to Captain Bennett. Grant gave a bitter laugh. Of course. Everyone suddenly salutes her, and now I'm the villain. No one answered him. That was the moment he lost control completely. Not because anyone shouted, because no one rushed to reassure him. I collected my letter, the broken watch, and the ring case from the dresser upstairs. My overnight bag was already in the closet. I packed only what belonged to me. Grant followed me into the bedroom. You cannot walk out like this. I folded 2 shirts and placed them in the bag. We have deposits, invitations. My firm's partners were downstairs. There it was. Not love. Logistics. Reputation. The inconvenience of consequences. He stood between me and the door. You embarrassed me. I looked at him until he moved. No, Grant. I stopped protecting you from yourself. I left the house before midnight. Admiral Shaw drove me back to my apartment in Annapolis. She did not ask questions during the ride. She only turned the radio low and kept both hands steady on the wheel. At my building, she gave me the wooden box. There will be calls, she said. I know. Some people will want the story. They won't get it. She nodded. Good. Before leaving, she handed me a plain white envelope. Inside was a copy of the full Meridian Review, declassified enough for me to read. Most names were still removed. Entire paragraphs remained blacked out. But Jonah's final transmission was there. Hold for no one. Tell Nightingale she gave us time. I read the line once. Then again. For years, I had imagined his last thoughts as accusation. They were not. They were permission. The following morning, I called the hospital and took 3 days off. Not because I was falling apart. Because for the first time, I understood that recovery did not have to be earned through collapse. Grant called 21 times. I answered once. He apologized for the dinner, the letter, the watch, and the joke. Then he said, but you should have told me who you really were. I ended the call. A week later, Lorraine mailed the engagement ring to my apartment. Grant never asked for it back directly. His firm's Naval Foundation proposal was quietly reassigned after Admiral Shaw disclosed a conflict in judgment, not my history. Richard sent a short letter saying he should have intervened sooner. I believed him. I did not forgive him immediately. Those were different things. Daniel Cross recovered fully. 2 months later, he invited me to a small veterans rehabilitation center outside Baltimore. He had begun volunteering there after his own retirement. I almost declined. Crowded military spaces still tightened something inside my chest. But I went. No cameras. No ceremony. No one announced my rank. Cross introduced me only as Claire. I began volunteering twice a month, helping former service members navigate emergency care, medication lists, and the strange loneliness of becoming civilians again. I did not tell them how to heal. I listened when they explained why they had not. 6 months after the dinner, I replaced the cracked leather strap on my field watch. I kept the old one in the wooden box. Not as evidence. As history. On the first warm morning of spring, I carried coffee onto the small balcony of my apartment. Sailboats moved slowly across the Chesapeake. A neighbor watered basil in a chipped blue pot. Somewhere below, a delivery truck backed into an alley with a soft mechanical beep. The sound startled me. My hand tightened around the mug. Then the moment passed. I stayed where I was. The watch rested against my wrist, keeping ordinary time. No countdown. No extraction window. No one waiting for me to prove I deserved the air in the room. For years, I had thought peace would arrive when the past finally stopped speaking. I was wrong. Peace arrived when I no longer obeyed every voice it carried. For a long time, I believed silence made me strong. I thought if I carried pain without complaint, no one could use it against me. I thought love meant making room for another person's insecurity. I thought peace was something I could preserve by becoming smaller. But silence is only strength when it is chosen. When it is demanded, it becomes a cage. Grant did not misunderstand me because I failed to explain myself. He misunderstood me because the version of me he respected had to be useful, agreeable, and easy to control. My rank did not make me worthy. The Admiral's recognition did not create my value. Daniel Cross calling me Nightingale did not turn me into someone important. I had been worthy when no one at that table knew my name. That was the truth I had spent years avoiding. Forgiveness does not mean returning to the place that hurt you. Compassion does not require surrendering your boundaries, and love should never ask you to erase the parts of yourself it finds inconvenient. I still keep Jonah's final words in the wooden box. But the box stays unlocked now. Some mornings, sunlight falls across the silver bird on the old patch. I no longer see a mission. I failed. I see the life I survived. And I remember this. Peace begins when you stop asking permission to protect it. If this story touched something you have carried quietly, I hope you remember that endurance is not the same as love, and silence is not always peace. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop protecting the people who keep crossing our boundaries. Share this story with someone who may need the reminder that quiet strength is still strength, even when no one recognizes it at first. And if you have ever had to choose your dignity over someone else's approval, know that walking away did not make you weak. It meant you finally believed your life deserved peace. Thank you for spending this time with me.